Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima, and I'll be conducting this workshop today on what they don't tell you about technical interviews. Can everyone hear me, see me okay, see my slides? I'm gonna just react with like a thumbs up. Okay, I'm gonna assume that everything's okay. Okay, so a bit about myself before we get started. I'm a software engineer at Yelp. I've been at Yelp for almost a year, actually over a year, a little over a year now. It was actually my 1 year anniversary this week. But yeah, so my this workshop was actually inspired because of my move over to Yelp. Because as I was going through the technical interviews myself, I felt that there's a lot more that goes into your success in a technical interview, other than just the your knowledge of data structures and algorithms. So yeah, that's what I hope to shed some light on through this workshop. Just a disclaimer that as we move forward, this presentation isn't sponsored by Yelp or anything, and any opinions or views that are expressed here are held exclusively by myself. So this is what the workshop is going to look like. We're going to go very chronologically. So we're good, like it's a very end-to-end sort of a presentation. I'm going to start off from the very beginning where, you're just starting to reach out to recruiters and you're networking. Then I'm going to talk about the actual interview. And then lastly, in the post-interview stage, I'm going to talk about things like compensation and negotiation. So if that's something that you're interested in, please stay tuned. So I'm going to start off by talking about the pre-interview stage. And just to be super clear, I'm not going to talk about any of the prerequisites. So I'm not going to talk about what a good resume looks like because, honestly, that could be a separate workshop altogether. I want to talk more about the art of networking during COVID because the pandemic has undoubtedly changed the recruiting landscape, right? Recruiting doesn't look the way that it used to look in the pre-pandemic world. It's all conducted virtually now, right? Obviously, in the pre-pandemic world, we were used to in-person interactions with our recruiters. Recruiters would either come to our campuses to conduct info sessions, or you would meet them in person through, say, hackathons or tech conferences or tech related events. But obviously, we don't really have that sort of a luxury anymore. So the first question is, how do you go about networking in this virtual world that we live in now? And to get that conversation started, I want to first talk about your elevator pitch. Now, an elevator pitch is this brief introduction that you prepare for yourself. And as the name implies, it should be effective enough to catch someone's attention in the same amount of time as an elevator ride. So ideally, it should be short and sweet, but effective nonetheless. Now, a couple of tips for your elevator pitch. First of all, please be genuine. I think that if you're genuine, your enthusiasm and passion really shows. And I also say this because keep in mind that recruiters deal with a lot of people on a daily basis. So they're pretty good at figuring out whether or not someone is or isn't being completely honest about either their past experiences or their skill set. So, just always be honest, always be genuine. Secondly, express genuine interest in the company. Like really sit down and think about why you want to work for this particular company. Is it the engineering culture? Is it the product? Is it the culture of innovation that really excites you? Is it the culture of mentorship? Whatever it is, I highly encourage you to think about this question very early on for a couple of reasons. One, this is a fairly typical question. Like your recruiter is for sure going to ask you this question. And then in even later parts of the interview, this question is bound to come up. So like the earlier you address it, the better it is. Secondly, as someone who's conducted a lot of interviews like myself, I can't tell you the number of people that come into interviews having not a clue what the company does that they're interviewing for. And as someone that's sitting on the opposite end of the table, I can tell you that it reflects really, really badly on you, right? Like it just tells me that like you're very disinterested, you don't really care about this opportunity. You probably just saw the opening by my company, you went ahead and applied, and you didn't really give it a second thought. Obviously, that's not something that you want your recruiter to be thinking about you. Now, when I say do your research about the company, by no means am I saying that, oh, you should know what their last quarter's EPS earnings were. But like at the very least, go to their company website, read up on their mission statement, read up about their values, just so you have something that you can, something that you can share in your response to this question. I can give you an example of like how I typically like to respond to this question. So I like to talk about three different things in my response to this question. In the first part, I talk about the technical appeal of the company. So if I were to join this company, how would they help me improve my technical skill set as a software engineer? In the second part, I talk about the cultural appeal. So are there any parts of the culture that I've either heard about or, I've read about that I really like, and, I would want to be a part of that. And in the third part of my response, I talk about particular initiatives that the company might have done in the past or is currently, has currently undertaken that I really like, or like, maybe they really resonate with me. So to give you an example, in my interviews with Yelp, for the third part of my response, I said that I really liked the way Yelp responded to small businesses when the pandemic hit, right? I do tell people that like you can kind of consider the third part optional, because obviously this is the part where you're going to have to do the most amount of research in the company. But I do think that if you do the third part well, you will really showcase just the level and the depth of your interest in the company. And I can promise you that you will walk away from the interview being a very memorable candidate. Okay, moving on. So on this slide, you basically see two screenshots of messages that I sent out in my most recent job hunt. The motivation behind this slide is to demonstrate how you should tailor your approach based on the person it is that you're reaching out to. So I'll start off with the one on the left, which is just a message that I sent to a recruiter on LinkedIn. Now, I think that as far as recruiters are concerned, it's perfectly okay for you to be very like straight to the point. You don't need to like sugarcoat your message. You don't need to beat around the bush. You can just get straight to the point. Be mindful of a recruiter's time, just like you're reaching out to a recruiter, there's likely hundreds of other people reaching out to that very same recruiter at the very same time. So you want to make sure that you get your point across, but you do it in like a very well-organized, concise manner. So as far as reaching out to recruiters is concerned, I usually suggest like a template. So, quickly start off by introducing yourself, then mention the exact opening or the exact posting that you're interested in. Quickly talk about why you think you would be a good fit for that opening. And then lastly, always include your resume for future reference. I think that's like a good enough template as far as recruiters are concerned. Moving to the screenshot on the right, this is a message that I sent to a former colleague of mine. It's just a Facebook message, and I was hoping that they could refer me for an opportunity at their company. Now, I do think that as far as people within your network are concerned, so this includes friends, former colleagues, people that you went to school with, I do think your approach should be slightly different, because ultimately you share a different relationship with these people, and you do not want to make them feel like you're just using them as a means to an end, right? So what I know that like it can be very awkward reaching out to people, right? Like let's say you went to school with someone and you haven't chatted with them like in over 4 years, and now obviously you want them to refer you at their company. I know it can be very, very awkward trying to break that ice, but something that I always suggest is that it's always a good idea to reach out to that person and ask them to like if they would be okay having like a quick virtual coffee chat with you. I think that's a great way to help break the ice, right? And in that conversation, try to make the conversation about them. Try to get them to talk about themselves, about what they do, whether they enjoy their job, what parts of their job they enjoy, they don't enjoy, what parts, whether they like the company. Try to get an insight into the company culture, all of that, right? Get them to talk about themselves. Also, I say this because keep in mind that these people are the best opportunity that you have to get to know both the pros and the cons of working at a given company, right? A recruiter, on the other hand, like obviously by no fault of their own, they might only showcase like the good parts of that company, right? They might not give you a very objective assessment of that company, right? But yeah, I do think like these people are the best shot that that you have of trying to get to see both sides of the coin. So again, use that to your advantage. And then, over the course of that conversation, you can slowly maneuver the conversation into asking them to refer you. But yeah, I do think that ultimately with these people, your approach should be different. You shouldn't be like a straight shooter as you would be with a recruiter, in which case, that's acceptable, but not with people that, within your network. Then another very popular question that I get is how many jobs you should be applying to. Sadly, there's no magical number. I wish there was, but I do have a couple of tips as far as this is concerned. First of all, I would really encourage you to harness the power of platforms like LinkedIn, Glassdoor, etc. I've personally used both of these very successfully. I got an internship off of Glassdoor, and then I got my most recent job off of LinkedIn. Secondly, as far as the process of applying to jobs is concerned, there's no denying that it is an incredibly boring, redundant process, right? There's no denying that. It's very monotonous. It's very repetitive. All it is that, you're going through job postings, you're shortlisting the ones that you're interested in, you're filling out the same fields over and over again, you're uploading your resume repeatedly. So it can quickly get like very overwhelming and very repetitive. So in terms of that, I've kind of experimented with both ends of the spectrum, in the sense that I've been the person who used to sit down every Sunday and, I would go through like thousands and thousands of job postings and apply to the ones that I was interested in. I wouldn't recommend going about it that way, because first of all, I think it's a very inefficient use of your time, right? Like if you're going through that many postings, you're likely not going to be done within like an hour. It's likely going to take you a couple of hours. And yeah, I just don't think it's like a very efficient use of your time. Secondly, there's also a pretty good chance that just because of the sheer number of postings that you have to sift through, you might miss out on a couple of really good ones. So overall, I wouldn't recommend going about it that way. Something that I did instead, when I was trying to change my job a year ago, was that I incorporated this into a part of my daily routine. So every day I used to set aside anywhere between like 30 to 45 minutes where I would just apply to jobs. Okay. Now there's very handy filters on all of these platforms that allow you to do that. I think there's a filter on like maybe LinkedIn, or I think both LinkedIn and Glassdoor, where you could filter the jobs that were posted within the last 24 hours. Obviously, if this is something that you do every day, you can start using that filter. That's what I used to do. And obviously that list isn't going to be as long, right? So it's very doable. It's very doable to go through all those postings within like 30 to 45 minutes. I think that's a much more efficient way of going about it. Like obviously you're time boxing yourself, right? So that's a great first step right there, right? And then secondly, I think it really helps with the mental pressure of applying to jobs as well. There's no denying that like there's a huge mental aspect to the process of applying to a job, right? At least for me, when I used to look for jobs, this was something that would weigh on me every single day, right? That, I would wake up, I'd be like, oh, okay, I have to apply for jobs today. So if you just make this into a part of your daily routine, I think it really helps deal with the mental aspect of it as well. Now, moving on to the actual interview, I'm going to first quickly give you like an overview of what the interview structure is like, at least for big tech companies. Obviously, this can look different for like medium-sized companies or startups, but you'll see common elements in all of them. So it starts out with a recruiter reaching out to you with either a phone screen or an online coding assessment. In some cases, you can also get a take-home assignment. Now, I personally haven't seen a big tech company give out a take-home assignment yet. Usually, like big tech companies have like very standardized interview processes, and they like to stick to those. So you'll either get like a phone screen or like an online coding challenge. Take-home assignments, in my experience, I've seen are truer for like startups. Personally, like I'm not at all a fan of take-home assignments. I think that the amount of effort that you put into them is absolutely not worth what you get out of it. But just so you know, then depending on the outcome of this first round, there can be another round that follows this. Now, this round can either be like a behavioral round, or it can be a live technical coding round. If it's a behavioral round, it's going to be with an EM or an engineering manager, and the purpose of this will be to assess a cultural fit. If it's a live technical round, then, it's just going to be like you and I are talking right now. It'll just be an engineer on the other side, and you'll have to code your solution in front of them. And then if you pass this round, the second round, you basically move to your on-site. Now, in the pre-pandemic world, the on-site was the part where the company would fly you out to their headquarters and you would basically spend an entire day in interviews. However, in the virtual world that we live in now, this is also conducted virtually. This is anywhere between 4 to 6 hours. Again, this depends on the company. It varies a lot by company. It's a combination of technical, behavioral, and system design rounds. There can be anywhere between 2 to 3 technical rounds, 1 system design, and 1 to 2 behavioral rounds. Now, to give you an example, my on-site with Amazon was 5 hours long. There were 5 rounds in total. Each round was 45 minutes in total. And Amazon does something like called a hybrid sort of a round. So what that means is that like it's a combination. Each round is basically a combination of behavioral and technical interview questions. So the first 10 to 15 minutes were spent on behavioral questions, and then the rest of the time was spent on technical questions. But I've also interviewed with like other companies. So Yelp, for example, didn't do hybrid rounds. They had dedicated rounds that were either behavioral or technical in nature. So like I said, you can see like a lot of variation here. Another thing that I want to mention at this point is that not every company might do this, but some companies might give you the option to split your on-site across 2 days. Again, like I said, not every company will do this. Like, for example, when I was interviewing with Twitter, I was given this option. But yeah, I wanted to share this. I think it's valuable. It's a valuable piece of information. Let's say if you're feeling very concerned about your on-site, if you feel too overwhelmed, if you feel you're not going to be able to perform well in like one go, this is always something that you can ask your recruiter, right? Speaking of your recruiter is your primary point of contact throughout this entire process, all the way from like the very beginning to the very end. And as you move to your on-site, they will set up a chat with you to inform you of all the logistics of what your on-site will look like. So that includes the structure of the interviews, the duration, the names of the interviewers, etc. They'll make sure that you're well versed in all of that. And then in this chat that they set up with you, I highly encourage you to use this opportunity to ask them anything that will put you at ease during the interview, right? So this can include things like, oh, how will the technical rounds be conducted? Are you expected to write production level code or pseudocode? What sort of a platform will they be using, right? So like, are they going to be using HackerRank or CoderPad, or can you use like an IDE of your choice? When can you expect to hear back? Like, you know, how will the system design rounds be conducted? So like, you know, can you write things down on your own notepad and then kind of hold it up for your interviewer to see, or can you use like a virtual whiteboard? In case that you are using a virtual whiteboard, so let's say you're using like something like Google Jamboard or something, I will highly encourage you to get familiar with that before the interview, just so you know you're aware of all the features and functionality and all of that. You're comfortable using it. And then lastly, you can even ask them what level you're being considered for. And the reason why I included this last question is because a lot of the times for software engineering postings online, you'll see like a very generic looking posting, and it won't really specify what level you're being considered for. And the reason why that happens is because usually tech companies have openings across a wide variety of engineering levels. So what they do is that they put out this generic looking posting, and then based on the candidate pool and the results of their on-sites, they assign the level that they think a candidate is most well suited for, right? Now, the reason why I encourage you to ask as many questions as you can is because I think that like interviewing is like challenging enough as it is, right? There's so many unknowns, right? You don't know what
are these texts.
You don't.
I've read it. What's better than?
You don't know what questions you're going to be asked, right? You don't know any of that. There's already a lot of unknowns. So I think like trying to figure out as many of those unknowns is really helpful, right? Like, I know that like trying to figure out what sort of coding platform they'll be using may sound very trivial to you right now, but I can assure you that it's not. Like, I think if you know this, it just helps. I think overall it just helps, right? For example, at one point I was interviewing with this startup, and I remember walking into the interview, and like there was no setup, right? Like they hadn't shared like a link with me. Usually companies share a link to the coding platform that you will be using during the interview before the interview. I walk in, there's nothing of that sort available. So I asked the interviewer, I'm like, okay, how do you want me to code my solution? And he just went, just open up Notepad and go ahead, right? Now, coding in Notepad is very different from like coding in like our usual IDEs and all of that, right? So I think it just helps, like having all these, like trying to figure out as many of these unknowns as you can. I think ultimately it just helps you deal a bit better with, the anxiety surrounding interviews. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the the behavioral and the technical parts. I'm going to start off with the behavioral one. So I have a very interesting like history as far as behavioral interviews are concerned. For the longest time, I used to think that behavioral interviews were like the easy parts of the technical interview process. And like in my head, I was like, oh, it's just like a conversation that you have with your interviewers. Like, how bad can it really be? And why on earth should I like prepare to have a conversation with someone? It should come fairly naturally. It should be like a fairly organic sort of a process. Let me tell you right off the bat that is a very misguided way of going about it, because your behavioral interviews are as important as your technical interviews. They're not filler rounds, they are there for a reason. And through your behavioral interviews, your interviewer is looking for certain signals from you as a candidate. Now, when you're going to start reading about technical interviews, you're going to hear the word signal being thrown around a lot. And a signal basically refers to like a specific like trait that they're looking for, right? So signals that they're very commonly looking for include things like your communication skills, your collaboration skills, right? Like, can you collaborate within a team setting? Your ability to take feedback, right? So are you someone who's very receptive to feedback, or do you get like very defensive about it? These are all signals that they're looking for through your interviews. So yeah, coming back to what I was talking about, behavioral interviews are there for a reason. And through your behavioral interviews, your interviewers are looking for certain signals from you as the candidate. Now, the list that you see here, this is just like a quick list that I put together. These are some very, very typical questions that you can expect to be asked in a behavioral interview. Don't worry about like writing these down or anything. I'll share the slide deck afterwards. But yeah, at the very least, I think you should be very well prepared to at least answer these questions. As far as your responses to behavioral interviews are concerned, first of all, please be honest. Do not fabricate experiences, because you will most likely be caught. And I say this because interviewers always ask follow-up questions. Okay, so let's say that I'm the interviewer. I ask you a question. You weren't well prepared to answer this question, so you just quickly came up with something on the spot, and you shared that with me, right? Now, that conversation isn't going to end there. What I'm going to listen to your response, and then I'm going to pick out specific elements from your response, and I'm going to ask you about it. So in that follow-up, like cross-examination that happens, if you shared something that that didn't happen, or if you shared something that you just came up with on the spot, I'm likely going to figure out that you're either not being honest, or you just weren't well prepared to answer this question. And obviously you don't want your interviewer to think either of those two things about you. So as far as behavioral interviews are concerned, please just always be honest. Secondly, be a good storyteller. And I think one of the best ways of going about that is to use the STAR format. I'm not going to delve into the details of the STAR format, but you should definitely look this up on your own time. But I'll just say that this is a very popular, widely used format within the tech industry, especially when responding to behavioral questions. In fact, before my on-site with Amazon, they actually sent me a handout where like they specifically mentioned that we really like it if our candidates use the STAR format to structure their responses to behavioral questions. Then for each category that I showed you on the previous slide, I always advise people to prepare at least more than one experience, right? And the reason why I say this is because a lot of these questions are repeated by your interviewers. Like they might change the wording around a little bit, but like the central theme of the question basically stays the same. So in order to avoid sounding too repetitive, or rinsing and repeating the same story over and over again, I think it's always better if you go into your interviews having multiple experiences and multiple scenarios that you can share with your interviewer. Next, show what you've learned from your experiences, even if they were failures. And the reason why I included this here is because I know that for a lot of candidates, questions that have to do with failures or setbacks or weaknesses of yours tend to be very scary, right? And a lot of people think that, oh, these are meant to be like trick questions. I can assure you that they're not. These are not trick questions. However, there is a trick to answering these questions. First of all, the right response to if what's like a weakness of yours is never that you work too hard. That is not what the interviewer is hoping to hear. What you have to remember for your responses to these questions are basically three things. You're going to share your experience, then quickly talk about what you learned from that experience, and then talk about how you change your ways moving forward from that experience. That's it. That's all that those are the three components that you need. If you talk about those three components, you basically show your interviewer that you've come full circle. And that is exactly what they want to hear from you. Like, think about it this way. What is a failure at the end of the day? A failure always presents you with an opportunity to improve, right? A failure always presents you with an opportunity to like identify an area that you lack in and to work on it, right? And that is exactly what your interviewer wants to hear from you in your responses to questions like these. So that's it. Like that's all you have to talk about, and you're going to be all set for questions of these nature. Lastly, if you're asked a question that you don't have an answer to right away, you can ask your interviewer if you can have 1 to 2 minutes to think about it. I actually wasn't aware that you could do this, but I have done this and this is perfectly okay. However, please do keep in mind that interview rounds are only, again, like I said, anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour. So, obviously you're not going to have 5 to 10 minutes to think about a question. Even if you are, your interviewer will just move you on to the next question. However, if you do need like a couple of seconds or 1 to 2 minutes to just structure a response in your head, it's perfectly okay for you to use that time. Okay, moving on to the technical parts of the interview. Like I said at the very beginning, the purpose of this workshop is not for me to walk you through all the different data structures that you should know or the algorithms that you should know to be successful in your technical interviews. I think there's like more than enough resources available on the internet that can probably guide you a lot better than I can. What I want to focus on is the optimal strategy that you should have for your technical interviews. And again, I deliberately chose to talk about this aspect because something that I noticed when I was going through my interview preparation was that I used to see a lot of frustration in candidates around their success in a technical interview, right? Like I would see a lot of people talk about, oh, we got the question right and everything, but we still didn't get the offer, right? And that's what kind of helped me realize over time that I think we kind of approach technical interviews with like a very like one-dimensional kind of lens, right? We only fixate on getting to the best solution, right? We don't think about anything else, and there's a lot of other factors that you're being actively kind of assessed on, right? And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. So to start off, please keep in mind that questions are kept purposefully vague, and it is your job to clarify, because being a good software engineer isn't just about churning out code 24/7, right? There's a lot of other aspects to your job, and a very big aspect and very important aspect to your job is your ability to do requirements gathering, right? And what that means is basically, asking questions, asking good clarifying questions. How do you deal with vague specifications in the question prompt, all of that, right? Basically, think of it this way, that let's say you're the engineer, a consumer comes to you and they want something, right? Now it's on you to like ask them questions and to basically flesh out what the product is going to look like, right? Like if you come to me and you're like, oh, I want a website, it's on me to ask you questions about like, oh, what sort of website, what kind of text do you want on it, what sort of colors do you want, what sort of like features or functionality do you want, right? That's on me. And that's exactly what I mean when I say the ability to do requirements gathering. So that's on you. That's something that you have to do in a technical interview. Don't jump into the question not having clarified any assumptions or corner cases or things of that sort. Next, write down test cases, specifically corner or edge cases. And I say this very early on because I know that as software engineers, we tend to have this horrible tendency to not think about testing, right? Like we do not enjoy testing. We try to like push it off as much as we can. But you cannot do that in a technical interview. Don't go into an interview assuming that, oh, I'll think about testing in like the last 5 to 10 minutes. No, like you do not have that guarantee. You never know. Like, let's say you get a really hard problem. Let's say you struggle on it. You're not going to have the last 5 to 10 minutes to think about testing, right? So this is something that you need to start thinking about before you start working on your solution. So what you should do is that start thinking about the corner or edge cases, write them down, and then quickly work with your interviewer to see what the expected test outcome should be. And this is a good exercise to do because it confirms that you've understood the question the way it was intended. Okay, you do not want to be in a situation where you understood a question a certain way, you didn't bother clarifying your understanding, you dove right into the solution, and 45 minutes later, at the end of the interview, you realize that, oh, your understanding was completely different from the way your interviewer had intended it to be, right? You do not want to be in a situation like that, which is why I think this is a very useful exercise to do. So once you've done all of this, once you've talked about the test cases, you've listed them, you can start working on your solution. Again, please, something to keep in mind is the importance of communication. Communicate effectively, talk things out loud, discuss trade-offs, different strategies that you're considering, etc. You have to realize that your technical interviews, like if you take away anything from this workshop, please let it be the importance of communication. Communication is so important in a technical interview. I have been in interview situations where I did not get to the best solution. I was maybe like 60 to 70% there. But just because I was communicating very well, I not only passed those interview rounds, I actually got great feedback following them as well. So again, which is why I'm saying this, that it's so important to communicate effectively. Please don't be that person who, once you get the question, you're just off in your corner for the next 30 minutes, silently working on the problem. I can promise you that even if you get the best solution on the planet, you're not going to pass those interview rounds because the interviewer has no insight into your strategy, right? That's what technical interviews are about. They basically want to see, an interviewer wants to see your approach to problems from like the very moment a problem is presented to you all the way to the very end, right? But if you've been silent, the interviewer will have no insight into your process, right? They'll have no insight into your strategy. So yeah, so please keep this in mind. If you're stuck, you can ask for help. But again, there's a caveat to this, and the caveat is that you can only ask for help provided that you've been communicating well. Like if you've been silent for the past 20 minutes, even if the interviewer wants to help you, they won't be able to help you out. Another great benefit of effective communication is that if just because the interviewer knows what direction you're headed into, if they feel that you're going too off track, they'll actually like cut you off right there and they'll nudge you into the right direction. So, that'll end up saving you a lot of time, and time is of the essence in a technical interview. Next, not every interviewer will allow you to compile your code and see if the test cases pass. Now, I say this because, like in your own personal time, let's say you're working on like a really challenging lead code problem. I know we've all been in a situation where, like you're almost there, but there's still a couple of test cases that are failing. So what you do is that you make a little change, you hit the run button. There's still a couple of test cases that are failing. So you make another little change, you hit the run button, and you just get into the cycle of making a change, hitting the run button, making a change, hitting the run button. Now, I call this the abuse of the run button, and you cannot under any circumstances do this within a technical interview, because this tells your interviewer two things about you. One, that you do not have the debugging abilities to figure out what the problem with your logic is. And secondly, that you rely on automated testing to tell you what the problem is. Obviously, you don't want your interviewer to be thinking either of those two things about you. So going back to the optimal strategy that I was talking about, once you're done working on your solution, what you're going to do is that using the test cases that you identified earlier, you're going to step through your code line by line. And when I say line by line, I mean line by line. You're going to step through it line by line, and you do this because you want to make sure that your logic is working as expected. Again, this is a great exercise to do because you'll likely be able to catch little like errors here and there. If there's logical or like syntax errors, you'll probably be able to catch those little errors, right? But this is a very important exercise that you need to do in a technical interview. Next, for system design rounds, it's important to draw diagrams or class diagrams if the question is about object-oriented design. And this is because they want to see how what your understanding is of the different components in the system and how they're interconnected. Now, I don't talk about system design interviews in this session, because honestly, I think again they warrant like a separate workshop about them altogether. I will say though that do not underestimate system design rounds. I think they prove to be the Achilles heel for a lot of interview candidates, because again, this isn't really something that we're taught as undergrads. Like no one is designing systems at scale as undergrads, right? To give you an example, system design rounds are basically like very high level questions. So it could be like something like, oh, design like Google Drive or design like Facebook Messenger, right? The point of system design interviews is not for you to talk about like the low level implementation details. It's more to talk about like the big level concepts. So, things like, oh, what sort of database choices will you be making? What sort of like caching mechanisms will be in place? How do you scale the system, right? How do you scale the system as you ramp up traffic? Things like that. For intern interviews, there's probably not going to be a design component to your interviews. You might get like an object-oriented design sort of a question. So something like, oh, design a parking lot or design like an elevator system. But like, you're most likely not going to get like a full-blown system design question. But for new grad roles and anything beyond that, especially as you start going up the engineering ranks, if you want to become a senior engineer, this is like an unavoidable part. And in fact, a lot of your success as a senior engineer is contingent on your performance in system design rounds. So bottom line being, please do not underestimate them. If you have more questions about them, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. Lastly, if you're very nervous about your technical rounds, I would advise you to watch real life technical interview videos. Now, this is something that I did, and I advise this to everyone that I can. I think that at this point, technical interviews definitely have a reputation, right? Like they have a reputation of being so scary and so overwhelming and like so intimidating. And that's why you're here, right? Like you're probably also aware of that reputation. And then secondly, I think that as candidates, we go into these interviews assuming expecting perfection from ourselves. Like we go into these interviews thinking that we could not afford to be anything less than perfect. And if we are, we're not going to get that offer. And that could not be further from the truth, because no one is expecting perfection from you in a technical interview or any interview for that matter, because at the end of the day, an interview is an interaction between two human beings. And by the very nature of that, there's bound to be like little issues here and there, little mistakes that you make here and there. And I can promise you that most of those mistakes are forgivable mistakes, okay? So things like a lot of people stutter when they're nervous. I do that. It's perfectly okay for you to do that. It's okay not to have the right answer right away. It's okay to struggle during your interview. It's okay to ask for help. Again, all of these are forgivable mistakes, okay? So I think watching these videos is just kind of helped humanize the process for me, at least. I like watching actual people and how they behave and perform in an actual interview setting. I think it was just very helpful just to kind of help calm me down and be like, okay, it's not horrible. It's not something that I can't do. It's not something that I can't deal with. So yeah, I would suggest the same if you're feeling a similar way. Okay, so in the post-interview stage, I'm going to first quickly talk about how hiring committees work, because I think that as candidates, we tend to assume the worst, and that's because we don't have any insight into what happens behind the scenes once we're done our interviews. So basically what happens is that once you're done your on-site, your recruiter puts together this package for you that includes your resume, any coding samples that you submitted in your interviews, and then feedback from all the interviewers that met you. This package is then sent over to the hiring committee, which makes the final decisions as to whether or not an offer is going to be extended to a candidate or not. Now, the frequency at which hiring committees meet can be very different based on the company. For some companies, they meet as often as 2 to 3 times a week. So with those companies, the turnaround time is going to be very quick, and you're likely going to hear back about the results of your interviews within 2 to 3 days. However, again, this can really vary based on the company. So that's why there might be a little gap between once you finish your interviews and then once you hear back about the results of your interviews. In case you're rejected, obviously that's not an outcome that any candidate hopes for, but I do think that there's a professional way of addressing a rejection. Please don't be that person who, just reads the rejection email and then off to the junk folder, out of sight, out of mind. At the very least, thank your recruiter. And then if company policy allows, you can always ask them for feedback. Now, bigger tech companies have explicit policies that don't allow them to share feedback. However, like smaller companies are usually pretty like okay with it. I personally asked 2 of the companies that I interviewed with for feedback, and they were very gracious enough to share it with me, and that feedback is obviously invaluable. In case you accept the offer, still thank your recruiter. But if you do have interviews scheduled with other companies, please be respectful. Let them respectfully know of your decision. Don't waste anyone's time. Don't waste anyone's time, and do not ghost them. In case you reject the offer, still thank your recruiter. And I think that irrespective of whatever the outcome of your interview is, it's always better to never shut the door completely on a given company unless you saw some explicit red flags in your interviews with them. I think it's always better proposing to stay connected for future opportunities, because this way, not only does your network continue to grow, but the next time that you're in the job market, you'll have some solid places to start from. And yeah, this is just an email that I sent out to just demonstrate what I just said. But yeah, again, I'll share this slide deck afterwards, so you're absolutely free to use this if you want. Okay, so this is the last and final part of my presentation. This is something that I absolutely love talking about. I'm very passionate about this, and for a couple of reasons. One, I think this is something that about which there's a huge lack of awareness. I think there's so many people out there who don't know that you have and you should absolutely negotiate your offer. Secondly, I think that even for people who do know, there's a lot of awkwardness surrounding this conversation, right? Like it's not, I am yet to meet someone who said that, oh, negotiation is like a fun conversation to have. It's kind of not. It's like a pretty awkward conversation to have, especially if you're like very new at it. So I'll tell you what like my personal experience has been here. It's not been good, which is why I make it a point to always talk about this in this session. So I knew about the importance of negotiation very, very early on. Like I knew about it from like I think second year of university. I had a lot of seniors who like, you know, had drilled into me that, you know, you always should negotiate, never take the first number that they throw your way, all of that. But by the time that I got to my first full-time offer, and when it came to the conversation of like compensation, I just chickened out. At that time, I think I was just so insecure and so unsure of what I was bringing to the table and whether the number that I had in mind, whether it was justified, that I didn't even bother. Like I didn't even give it a try. I didn't even ask once for a higher salary. And I cannot tell you how badly I regretted it for the next 2 years of working at that company. So to help you avoid a situation like that, let's get into this discussion. So I'm going to first quickly give you an overview of what typical compensation packages in tech are like, because they can have a lot more components than what we're usually used to. So there's a base salary, and this is what we're all pretty much used to, and this is usually the most difficult to negotiate. Then there's your restricted stock units or your RSUs. This is basically just company equity, but what you have to understand here is the vesting schedule. Usually companies have a 4-year vesting schedule. And what that means is that every year, 25% of your RSUs will like vest. Your RSUs are only worth anything to you once they have vested. Okay, so let's say that tomorrow you sign a contract with a company and they grant you 100K worth of RSUs. Now, at the time that you have signed the contract, the RSUs are equivalent to like $0 to you. Okay, because they have invested, they're not worth anything to you monetarily. However, after your first 1-year anniversary of working at that company, 25% of those RSUs will vest. And at this time, they're basically just company stocks. So you can choose to do whatever you want with them. You can sell them. You can choose to sell them at a later time. It's completely up to you. But yeah, just make sure that you understand what the vesting schedule is for your company. There's a yearly bonus. Again, this is pretty standard. It's a set percentage of your base salary and it's prorated. And what that means is that you, like, let's say if you worked for a company for half a year, your yearly bonus will be half of what it would have been if you had worked there the entire year. Now, something that I've seen about yearly bonuses over the course of my career is that they can really vary based on like the industry that you're kind of in. So I used to work for fintech earlier. I used to work for a trading firm, and like fintech is actually kind of known for having like astronomical yearly bonuses. Like that's how they kind of make up. They're usually their base salaries aren't that high, but they make up for it by having like crazy yearly bonuses. So the yearly bonus at like my previous company could be anywhere between like 10 to 20% of your base salary, which is obviously quite a bit. But I've also worked for other companies where the yearly bonus was like as small as like 2.5% of your base salary. So like I said, you can see a lot of variation there. And then lastly, there's a signing bonus, and this is usually where you have the most room to negotiate. But keep in mind that a signing bonus is a one-time thing, and you only get it in the first year that you sign your offer. As far as research about your compensation numbers is concerned, obviously talk to your friends, see if they're comfortable sharing their packages. And I think it's always better to talk to friends across a wide variety of industries, because it just gives you, I think it just gives you a much better idea of what the market might be willing to offer you. And I always suggest talking to friends across a wide variety of industries. So talk to a friend who's working as a software developer at, say, like a bank versus, say, a hedge fund versus, say, like a big tech company, right? As far as resources online are concerned, I actually wouldn't recommend Glassdoor. I would recommend something like levels.fyi. It's a lot more reliable. Then it also, it breaks down the salaries for you into these different components that we talked about. And then lastly, it also gives you transparency as to how salaries differ based on location. So keep in mind that you could be working for the exact same company in the exact same team, but you could be making something very different if you're, say, based in San Francisco versus London, let's say Toronto versus, say, London. So Levels offers you that sort of a transparency as well. Next, never accept an offer as soon as it's presented. I know it can be very tempting to do so, but please do not do it. Your recruiter will likely call you to discuss the compensation package. And at this time, you should just jot down the details, thank them, and ask them how long you have to accept the offer. I say this because usually offers in tech are called exploding offers, and that's because you don't have a lot of time to accept the offer, usually like maybe a week or like 10 days. So it's always better to keep like a tentative timeline in mind. If asked, please never be the first to share a number or a range. Okay, like in North America, it's perfectly acceptable for you to do that. You could just politely decline. Again, like keep in mind that recruiters are very like well versed at having this conversation. So even in like the very initial phases when you're doing like HR screenings or things like that, they will most probably ask you that, oh, what are like your salary expectations and all of that. You can just politely decline. You can be like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable sharing that number, or you can be like, oh, could I please get back to you once I've done some market research. Another thing that you can do is you can actually flip the question on them, and you can be like, oh, what is someone with my level of experience and my role making at your company, right? Then I got a lot of advice in terms of like how you should kind of go about negotiating. So whether you should do it on a call or whether you should do it via email. Ultimately, I think, it depends on you. It depends on what you're more comfortable with. For me personally, I was like very awkward about the whole thing. I was also very unsure of my ability to negotiate because it was like my first time. So like I kind of had a fear that, if I try to do it over a phone call, my recruiter might be able to like, kind of get me to agree on the initial numbers that the company is putting forward, which is why I decided to email them instead. In your follow-up conversation, always thank them for extending the offer to you. And at this time, you should have concrete numbers ready and mention any competing offers or deadlines. However, please never lie to a recruiter about competing offers or compensation. And this is because not only are recruiters very well connected, they can also ask you to submit proof of competing offers or compensation. Lastly, recruiters really like it if you convey that you'll be ready to sign the contract immediately if they can get to your proposed numbers. And just to kind of demonstrate, here is the email that I sent out when I was trying to negotiate. Again, going back to the point that I was making earlier about negotiation, these 5 lines took me 30 minutes to come up with. And I was still so unsure of like this email that I sent it to like 5 of my friends to proofread. And only once they had given me like the green light did I eventually forward this to my recruiter. The email did get me good results. So, you're absolutely free to use this email template if you want. That is the end of my presentation. But before we finish things off, there's 2 things that I wanted to mention before we wrap up this conversation. One, a lot of people ask me if you can negotiate for your internships, and you absolutely can, and you absolutely should. There's no rule anywhere that says that you can't negotiate for your internships. I've helped my younger brother negotiate for 2 of his internships very successfully. So you should absolutely give it a try. Secondly, people ask me if you should try to negotiate even if you don't have any competing offers. And to that, I also say yes, 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 absolutely. There's no, I always tell people that the absolute worst thing that can happen if you try to negotiate is that they'll say no. Like that's it. That's the absolute worst thing that can happen. They won't retract your offer just because you're trying to negotiate a higher salary. So don't ever let that fear stop you from trying to negotiate. At the end of the day, like please keep in mind that negotiation, like other things in the world, is a skill. It's not something that you're magically going to know how to do once you get to your full-time offer. So like the earlier you get started, the better it is. Like if you start trying to negotiate for your internships, hopefully by the time you get to your full-time offers, you'll be a lot well versed in just kind of navigating this entire conversation. But yeah, that is the end of my workshop. Thank you so much for attending. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them right now. If not, you can reach out to me afterwards. I have my LinkedIn and email link there. I'll share the slide deck right after the workshop. I'm also happy to do resume critiques, mock interviews, or even if you just want to have a chat about just working in the tech industry in general. I would really appreciate if you could please fill out this feedback form. Again, it's linked here. It really helps me improve for future iterations of this workshop. But yeah, thank you so much for attending. I will share the slide deck in the Slack channel, but I can share it here as well. Give me a second. Copy. There you go. This is the slide deck. But yeah, I'll share it in the Slack channel as well. But yeah, thank you so much for attending this today, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Thank you so much for having this workshop. It was really, really useful.
Bye.